we'll certainly catch up with folks as they come in here. But first off, good evening. Thank you so much for taking the time to come out tonight or stay in and listen tonight. Our goal here is to share some of the output from the flood mitigation work that we've been developing for the University Boulevard neighborhood area. My name is Doug Olendijk. I'm the Community Development Director for the City of Clive. I've been given the opportunity to be the city's project lead on this university flood mitigation planning effort. Just as a quick bit of housekeeping, our intent for this presentation is really to be a start of a dialogue related to how the City of Clive can work with each of you in creating this resilient future for the neighborhood. Admittedly, tonight's going to be a little bit heavy on the presentation side of things, so in the format doesn't allow us great opportunity for dialogue, but we want to do the best that we can, leave time at the end here for conversation and questions. So if you do have some questions as we go through the presentation, please feel free to put them in the chat and we'll try and address them at the end. We'll also leave some time for open mic, if you will, to see if we can get a little dialogue going that way as well. The other aspect of that, and I'll repeat it a couple times here, this is the start of a dialogue. Success here is only going to come with us working together, which is going to mean that we're having to have conversations about how to be successful together. Each of you has a little unique circumstance to your situation. We recognize and understand that. And although we're not really set up in this format to kind of have those one-on-one conversations, please, as we kind of go through with this, let me know, let the city know that you're interested in having some additional dialogue, and we can talk very specifically about your situation, your piece of property, and how we can work together to come up with a better solution. So that's just the quick part. Like I said, I'll reiterate it a few times here, but we'll go ahead and get started with the presentation itself. Just as this kind of quick introduction to the project, as many of you know, the City of Clive has been working on a series of advanced flood mitigation planning efforts for a number of years now. We've covered a lot of ground, but we very quickly realized that early on in each one of these steps, we need to find good partners in trying to help us address some of these flood mitigation opportunities and understanding of risk. Each step of the way, we've consciously sought to bring on subject matter experts to help us. And in this case, we have a great partner in Stantec. Stantec's a nationally recognized firm that brings local knowledge of the Walnut Creek. They've done a lot of work on the hydrology and hydraulics of Walnut Creek. They also bring a significant expertise in the analysis of flood mitigation alternatives. So we're very pleased to have them with us tonight. You'll be hearing quite a bit from Jason and Jared on the content of the presentation. We also have Cassidy and Mimi as part of Stantec group that are here to help answer questions and address any concerns as we move along. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned previously, the city's been working actively in engaging in efforts to reduce flood risk in the University Boulevard neighborhood, as well as other parts of the community and the watershed as a whole. And we continue to realize that we have to be working not just in the small space, but we have to be thinking about how this relates, how this impacts, how that we can find partners to help in this bigger problem of flooding in the University Boulevard neighborhood. Following the last major flood, 2018 flood, the city really came to this realization that continuing to fight Mother Nature is probably not in the community's best long-term interest. And we've been transitioning a lot of our thoughts from trying to fix flooding, which none of us are going to be able to do. Fixing flooding is not going to be a solution. And we've been trying to find opportunities and look for sustainable ways that we can live with that flooding. Maybe to put it a different way, just like many of you, the City of Clive would like to be in a position in the future where there is little anxiety associated with the National Weather Service notification of a flood warning on Walnut Creek. Because we've taken the time to develop a strategy and we've consistently executed on becoming resilient to this continuing and growing threat of Walnut Creek. Next slide, please. And although we're going to spend most of our time tonight talking about specific flood mitigation alternatives that directly relate to the University Boulevard area, I did want to share that Clive is actively involved and looking for those broader solutions that we can develop with our upstream partners within the entirety of the watershed. So what we found in terms of these broader partnerships, can we store water up in the undeveloped portions, or can we find ways to maximize storage in green belts and other spaces that already exist in our neighbors' communities, Urbandale, Waukee, Dallas County, etc. Are there ways to partner up and find solutions that benefit Clive downstream? We've gone through and spent a lot of time looking at those, and we've had great partnerships with those neighbors. But what we have found is that a lot of those solutions, although are very good projects and have definite benefits, they don't necessarily solve or provide a significant benefit to this risk associated with University Boulevard area. So again, we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about those. We'd be happy to kind of engage in those other opportunities and other points of discussion. But I did want to let you know that we're not just thinking about what can we do in Clive. We're thinking about how can we find partners and really look at holistic solutions. So next slide, and we'll kind of let Stantec jump into this and talk about this specific flood mitigation project for the University Boulevard. Unmute, Jason.
Gets me every time. All right, so this is Jason Snyder here. I'll talk a little bit about the first part of the project scope here. It started with leveraging, the existing hydraulic data, the capture to the existing flood reduction measures. And this is really going to keep our baseline consistent by leveraging this existing model. It gives us the ability to use data that Stantec produced for FEMA, that's on your National Flood Insurance map, allows us to leverage data that was produced by the Corps of Engineers, data that's being used by the Walnut Creek Watershed Management Authority in their plan. So it really gives us a baseline to keep all of the modeling and the efforts same and pretty consistent. So you're not looking at somebody else's models producing different results. All of the results should be really similar and very comparable. We're going to look to identify some cost-effective and feasible flood reduction measures that fall in line with what the city really already has ongoing with their efforts, kind of like their plan and priorities. We're going to explore some federal funding options. And then in the final part of this is we're going to develop a funding strategy for this University Boulevard area that can be implemented, as presented, but yet flexible enough that as funding opportunities are available, it can be implemented in many different ways. We're going to continue the ongoing flood preparedness and then response efforts in the interim as some of the other things that can be done as part of this scope. Next slide, Jared. Kind of the agenda here. We're going to run through some other project overview items. We're going to talk about the infrastructure mitigation options. And when we talk about infrastructure, we're talking about building something really, levees, dams, that sort of thing is what we're calling infrastructure. We're going to discuss some building specific mitigation options. Some of the things here would be different types of flood proofing, and buyouts are kind of the main mitigation options as part of this plan. And then finally, to conclude this, we're going to talk about the path to mitigation for the city and for you all as property owners and stakeholders in this area, so you've got a good idea of where this is headed and how we're moving forward. All right, next slide. Next. All right, so the modeling approach, we used a base HECRAS model. It was very similar to the one produced by the City of Windsor Heights in their ongoing efforts. We did some updates to that model for our project area. We captured the buildings here, make sure they were blocked out in the model so there wouldn't be water where there's a building. We updated some of the terrain to make it more refined. And while the University Boulevard area is our area of focus, the project extends out to about 411 buildings in the entire model area. And what we're really doing with that is we are making sure that when we propose a mitigation option, it's not having a negative impact on any of the other buildings or properties or parcels, you know, in the surrounding area. Then we're going to focus in on the buyout area really when we do talk about our mitigation options. All right, next slide. So this is kind of a depth grid we've built. And this is the 1% or 100-year flood depths for the University Boulevard area. And I just want you to take a chance to look at this a little bit, see if you can identify where your building is or in the general area of your building and how deep the water is. And this is going to come in handy because later on we're going to talk about, you know, lowering or raising water surface elevations or depths. And I want you to get some perspective of this area when we talk about lowering the water surface elevation. Does that really affect you? Because a lot of this University Boulevard area, you know, the minimum flood depth in these areas is 4 feet. So it's some pretty significant flooding. Some areas, you know, 8 to 12, and most of the severe flooding of where it's 12 feet plus feet deep is kind of in the channel area. But there's some pretty significant flooding in these areas here of Walnut Creek. All right, next slide. So this is just kind of a flood model simulation of the 1% annual chance flood event here in Walnut Creek. And this just kind of gives you an overview of if the floodwaters are rising, this is kind of where it floods first. And then it gets to a point to where everything looks flooded, kind of like it is now. And now you're talking about the water just continues to flood in this area and gets deeper and deeper until we're going to end here and it's going to be at the max flood, or what we would call the 1% annual flood elevation here. All right, next slide. Jerry?
Yeah, I'll take over from there, at least for a few slides. So yeah, that leads us kind of to the next steps. So, you know, we use those, we run different scenarios through the models to understand we have to understand what the existing conditions looks like, and then we are able to model these different alternatives that we'll talk about in a few minutes here. And what we basically do is we compare the flooding depths essentially for the existing conditions versus the proposed, and we're able to actually quantify the difference between those and run it through essentially a benefit cost analysis, which is able to monetarily quantify what that gets us in terms of flood risk reduction. And this is, it's a good tool for being able to compare different alternatives to each other. So you'll see our preliminary results with that. But also this is a requirement for many of the federal funding sources. We have to essentially prove or analyze that any project that goes through certain funding programs is cost effective. And so this is a tool and a methodology produced by FEMA and the Army Corps of Engineers to keep everything in line and, you know, to make sure we're using consistent methodology. So we use those methods to consider these alternatives and compare them against each other, and also understand how these different alternatives would fare when we get kind of down the road to that funding strategy. So it's important to note that these are kind of in conceptual at conceptual levels in terms of the costs. The benefits are a little bit closer to, you know, what would be in line with kind of the final, you know, what would be a final kind of grant application. But some of these alternatives, you know, we consider them at kind of a higher level to understand if they were even worth pursuing further. And then you'll kind of see where we're headed in terms of what the preferred alternative is, and go from there essentially. And I do want to note, we present results. We do have results for kind of the total area that Jason noted, but we with this presentation, we're summarizing the results for the targeted buyout area that we talk about. So it's kind of the area along University Boulevard, kind of the priority area. So we do have results, and we have numbers for kind of everything in the larger kind of Walnut Creek study area. But what we present here is numbers specific to that buyout area. So I do want to just note that. So again, we've kind of hitting this a few times, but it's important to, understand where we're headed with this stuff. So the outcomes of this is, like I said, we're determining kind of the feasibility of these different alternatives. In addition to kind of getting those conceptual costs, we have taken a look at essentially feasibility considerations. So it's one thing to say this project would cost this much, but we're also thinking in terms of how quickly we could get certain things implemented, what sort of regulatory requirements there are for the different alternatives, that sort of thing. So, obviously an outcome of this meeting and, this project effort as a whole is to get feedback from you all, get feedback from the community, try to understand the individual preferences and thoughts coming from, you, the property owners, seeing as it's your community, and, it's always good to engage and understand where people are coming from. So again, just the two bolded items, we're headed for a preferred alternative and a funding strategy. We want to see, mitigation measures implemented. That's always our goal, here at Stantec, and it's good to see, obviously, communities able to reduce their risk and, like you said, Doug, alleviate anxiety around this stuff, because it's very, very damaging. So I think that leads us back to Jason, who's going to walk us through the infrastructure mitigation options. So again, we looked at a railroad bridge improvements, and we looked at a levee and floodwall scenario. So when we say infrastructure, we mean kind of larger, sometimes people refer to them as structural mitigation options. So they're kind of the bigger, tend to be costlier projects. And we looked at those two alternatives to see essentially how they would fare, given the goal of reducing water surface elevations, reducing flooding, and running it through that benefit cost analysis methodology. So Jason, back to you.
All right. So alternative one would be the railroad bridge improvements. This alternative is basically, we want to make some hydraulic improvements to this railroad bridge, basically remove the existing bridge superstructure, which is the steel structure you can kind of see there in the picture. We would remove those abutments that are constricting the channel on that area, and then we would increase that span from about 120 feet out to 150 feet. This would increase the channel capacity and allow us more water to flow through there easily, quickly in a major flood event. The cost of improving that bridge and replacing it with a bridge, it's about 150-foot span. It's roughly almost $10 million is kind of the cost that we're looking at to be able to do those improvements. If we wanted to do anything else besides like increasing the span, like if we wanted to move the entire bridge, say above the 100-year floodplain, those type of improvements really don't look at getting feasible, because you've got to increase the track height and everything else to go along with it. And that just gets to where it would be a project that's probably impossible to ever get completed, working with the railroad to get the track heights increased, because you would be chasing it probably miles on each sides of the stream to actually raise the track and the track height enough to actually remove that area and that bridge from the 100-year floodplain. But next slide, Jared. So how we modeled this without actually designing a new bridge, was we completely removed the existing bridge from the flood model and reran the model. And as you can see, if that was to happen, it does decrease the flood elevations in our area of interest. Half a foot at the most. Some other areas not quite a half a foot. But again, I want to point out that, you know, a lot of these, that half foot decrease in flood mitigation, a half a foot is quite a bit of decrease in elevation, but you're already talking about water that was at a minimum of 4 feet deep. So if you own one of those structures, you know, having 3.5 feet of water or 4 feet of water in your structure, you know, doesn't really make a lot of difference to you, most likely as a property owner, and like what kind of efforts it would take for you to clean up or rebuild your structure if that 1% or 100-year flood event actually ever happens. All right, next slide, Jared. So this kind of goes into a little bit what Jared was talking about, the benefit cost ratio and how much benefit are we going to receive. So the benefits, you know, for those structures and that base flood elevation, you know, you get like $1.9 million of benefit for that $10 million cost. So that gets you the benefit cost ratio of about 2, you know, and like we were saying, this is a very optimistic modeling scenario we've got going on here. And likely everything cost would increase only by the time you would ever be able to make this improvement in this area, with the cost of construction rising, cost of actually having to deal with the railroad, and all of those other things that can really add to a project that you don't really consider until you actually get into actually trying to implement something like this. All right, let's go on to the next one. The next alternative we looked at was the levee and floodwall construction. This alignment and idea came from a feasibility study that the Corps of Engineers produced in 1992. And even that idea came from an older Corps of Engineers report. So you're looking at a levee and flood wall. There's almost 4,200 feet of levee, about the same amount of flood wall. And in places, this levee has to be 20 feet tall in order to provide protection against the 1% or the 100-year flood event. And, you know, the cost of building that levee and flood wall is almost $70 million. And we've got a cross-section view here just to kind of give you some perspective on what a 20-foot tall levee would really look like down in that area. You know, it's going to be taller than your average one-story home that you might have. So it would be a really big eyesore, you know, and that opinion of probable cost also doesn't include things like annual operation and maintenance that the city would have to do if they had this levee. It doesn't include cost to actually acquire the easements or the property that would be required to build the levee, because when you get talking about a 20-foot tall levee, the footprint at the bottom of that levee is 132 feet wide, and that's a substantial amount of area. When you talk about the area, the distance between Walnut Creek and the railroad or University Boulevard there, in a lot of places, that would be like almost the entire area of that area or that span. All right, next slide. This slide here just kind of shows you what kind of impact it has on the floodplain if this levee was built. The levee alignment you can kind of see there in yellow. And this is also going to highlight why we looked at more than just the buyout area. Is if you're familiar with the Indian Hills neighborhood, constructing this levee is going to actually increase the flood heights and increase the risk of residents in those homes alone. And for that reasons right there, most likely you would never be able to build this because it wouldn't be permitted by the Corps of Engineers or FEMA to allow you to construct something that's going to increase flood heights on someone else. All right, next slide. So the levee and floodwall construction, this kind of outlines benefit cost ratio here was 0.47. It would provide $32 million in benefits. The cost at 69 million. Like some of the things we kind of covered before, this has got a very substantial construction footprint. It increases the flood heights in other areas. You're going to have significant velocity increases in the water, and it's really going to cause erosion concerns probably downstream of this area. All right, next slide, Jared.
All right, I'll take it back over from there. I want to make sure I made this clear. I don't know if I pointed this out specifically, but yeah, with the benefit cost ratios, obviously, if the benefits need to outweigh the cost, that ratio we need to shoot for is 1 or higher. So yeah, those first two options not necessarily looking so hot in terms of feasibility and in terms of the likely cost effectiveness that would result from them. So this kind of lends itself to looking more specifically at building specific mitigation options. So there's a lot of different building specific things you can do. We looked particularly at two. We looked at floodproofing and acquisition. So we'll just jump right into that. So alternative 3, we looked at what is considered wet floodproofing. So it's basically retrofitting buildings on an individual level to be able to resist floodwaters. Two things of note. So this is considered active dry floodproofing, what we looked at particularly here and what results we'll share with you in a minute. And the reason it's active is because it requires the placement of shields or barriers at any openings such as doors and things like that. So it's, these projects would involve retrofitting these buildings, sealing the exterior, potential reinforcements. So like a masonry building wouldn't necessarily need reinforcements because those are pretty sturdy. But other types of building materials may require additional cost for those reinforcements. So the active nature of it, as opposed to passive, where it's nice to. Passive would be you don't have to do anything when you hear the flood alerts. But what we looked at here and the costs we considered, these are active. So we looked at these for non-residential buildings, and it's specifically non-residential because FEMA, if we were talking about, FEMA's the usual source of federal grant money for flood mitigation. So FEMA wouldn't fund residential buildings. That doesn't mean we couldn't do it necessarily, but it just means if we're talking about these kind of broader funding mechanisms, then this option would only apply to the non-residential buildings. So a couple things of note with this scenario. It is difficult to achieve true dry floodproofing. So dry means it does in fact keep the water out, as opposed to wet floodproofing, which is kind of allows for water to get through. It just means things like elevating utilities or kind of reducing the damage. It's basically acknowledging that water would get into these buildings, but making sure it doesn't do kind of more harm than you can avoid, kind of thing. So it is difficult to truly achieve this, and this also does require a fair bit of maintenance, probably on an annual basis, or especially after a flood. These things have a shorter useful life than some of those infrastructure improvements. So FEMA recommends kind of a 15 to 30-year useful life, and they don't recommend going up higher than 3 feet of flooding. So if you remember from the flood depth figure from a few slides ago, we have flooding depths definitely exceeding 3 feet for the 100-year storm or 100-year scenario. So this isn't necessarily a great option for all buildings, but it is an option for some of them, kind of on the outskirts of the flood zone. So that's kind of where we're headed with this option here. The costing of this kind of depends on a lot of things, but we kind of looked at it at, like I said, a more conceptual level. And roughly the cost that went into these is $11 per square foot of building area for every 1 foot of vertical foot of protection. So I'll give an example here in a second. So if that didn't make sense, don't worry too much. So here's an example structure. This is in fact roughly one of the buildings that we looked at here in the area, but we're not assigning like a, we're not telling you basically the address of it. So we're not singling anyone out, but Sorry if you can hear my cat in the background. So we looked at a roughly 5,000 square foot commercial building with a masonry exterior, and it required 2 vertical feet of flood protection based on the requirement of hitting the 100-year or 1% annual chance event. Those are basically the same thing. We use those interchangeably. So it would require 2 feet to get to that 100-year plus 1 foot requirement, which is pretty common. And so that's 5,000 square feet times 2 vertical feet of protection times that $11 figure, and that gets to roughly $110,000 for this example building that would be needed to protect this building. So again, this requires active application of barriers, and it does rely on the flood alert system because you have to apply those. Otherwise, it's you still get plenty of flood waters in your building. So again, we looked at with these structure specific options or building specific options. Well, similarly with even the infrastructure mitigation options, but we're able to calculate these things as kind of like area wide numbers, but we're also able to target in and hone in on what the impact is on a particular building. So with the flood proofing, we just have a chart here essentially showing the potential benefit for some of these buildings. So because the flood risk is so significant in this area, there is a pretty high there's a high potential for benefit, but there's not necessarily a high potential for that cost effectiveness. So obviously that cost effectiveness is kind of what we center around. On average, this did not appear to be a great option. The costs tended to get pretty high for some of the bigger buildings and some of the buildings with pretty high flood depths. And if you're getting discouraged by these lower benefit cost ratios, just sit tight. So that's kind of the gist of these results here, kind of at the structure level. This is, again, these are the results, just for comparison to kind of the other alternatives. These are the results for the total buyout area, even though we would treat these on a structure specific kind of level. These are just the results for kind of comparison to some of the other alternatives. So again, this is fairly optimistic in the sense that we assumed it was true dry floodproofing, that no water would get in. But as we said, that is contingent on adequate maintenance over the life cycle of this mitigation strategy. It does leave residual risk because if a flood came through that exceeded the 100-year, you would still, well, it exceeded the 100-year plus 1 foot, you would still get water essentially overtopping that protected level and damaging structures further. So we have to take these on a building by building basis. Sometimes this option tended to make sense, but sometimes it didn't. The costs were sometimes comparable to the final alternative we'll talk about in a second here, the acquisition piece. So sometimes the costs were comparable or sometimes it's far lower because as you can imagine, sometimes it makes more sense to just retrofit a building than to spend a couple $100,000 to buy it out. But in some cases, the costs of floodproofing the building actually exceeded the cost of what it would take to acquire the building. So those ones don't really make sense just intuitively to go that route, but this is an option that we have, kind of in our back pocket here. So I do want to, kind of that last bullet point there, it's this might make sense for some people. So this is, like I said, this is definitely something we're keeping in mind. And we didn't dig into this quite yet, but this is more, this floodproofing that we looked at is more of a permanent floodproofing scenario or mitigation strategy, and permanent meaning, 15 to 30 years. We didn't dig into potential interim protection measures. So some of the products you may have seen out there that involve like that are far less costly, but not necessarily as robust. Those may be some options too for a couple things for addressing kind of the interim need before we can actually implement kind of the permanent strategy. But that, that's, we don't have that for this presentation, but that is also in the back of our heads. Just wanted to point that out. So those are the first three. Like I said, trying not to get too discouraged with the benefit cost ratios. That leads us to the fourth and final alternative, which is acquisitions, which is a buyout program. So I will say we kind of knew, and thanks to Doug and a lot of the great work he's done, we kind of knew this is probably where this effort was headed in the first place. But we wanted to make sure we vetted those alternatives and made sure we weren't missing anything as far as other options before we go down the path or consider the path of basically buying out quite a few buildings in this this particular area. So for those that are unaware, this has been implemented. A few buildings have been acquired in the University Boulevard area. But in case you're unaware, what essentially involves is the city and whatever grant program is sponsoring it basically buys the property. So it's acquired. They demo the property and then place a deed restriction on the land. So you can build some stuff, but you can't really build permanent structures or anything like that after this type of mitigation strategy. And this is really the only true flood mitigation solution that leaves no residual risk, because you're essentially removing the potential for risk by acquiring and demoing the building. So even some of the structural options, I mean, we engineer those things to be as robust as they can be, but there's always residual risk. That's kind of, it's like leftover risk. Things do fail, or things have to be maintained, or things only have such a certain level of design level. So that's what we mean when we say residual risk. It means it's not completely eliminated in terms of true probability and statistic type approaches, but acquisition does in fact leave zero residual risk. So that is kind of also one of the major reasons why I kind of headed in this direction of looking at a buyout program. Definitely worth mentioning, these buyout programs are completely voluntary. It doesn't involve like eminent domain or anything like that. It has to be, the property, you as the property owners would have to agree to this before anything could happen. However, I will point out it's advantageous to do these in kind of clusters, if you will, because it's undesirable to have kind of what we call the checkerboarding effect, which is you have a couple buildings acquired, but a couple are left over. So that's why we kind of call it the checkerboarding. That's usually desirable to avoid, just for property values, and also because the more land you essentially free up, the more you can do with it. So a lot of the times after acquisition programs, we'll go in and either design some green space or park space or something like that. And actually, when we talk about the benefit cost analysis, when you do that sort of project, you can claim some environmental benefit by adding green space, by whatever it ends up being, whatever it would end up being, you can claim essentially benefit by adding either green space or wetland or further flood reduction area. So this tends to be, especially in cases like this with the amount of risk and just kind of the nature of this area, these tend to be pretty promising approaches. So here again, similar chart with the buyout area. Again, not surprisingly, we're seeing significant benefit numbers in this area, because it's essentially taking all the existing risk, and existing risk minus proposed risk, which is zero, ends up being all of the existing risk becomes benefit for these scenarios. We're showing the benefit numbers here, so like we can look at this a lot of different ways. So we don't want to throw too many confusing figures at you. We can also look at like the benefit cost ratio, for instance, for any individual building in this area. So that finally leads us to a positive benefit cost ratio when we looked at, again, this is just the buyout area. So what goes into the cost is basically the assessed value of the home, plus a markup to essentially account for market value. It also includes an allowance for the demolition, for things like potential asbestos removal, if that's an issue. and also some cost associated with essentially restoring that plot of land to green space. So that's what goes into the costs. And then, like I said, the benefits very promising for potential acquisition. So some kind of qualitative considerations here. Yeah, it's a tricky time to be talking about purchasing properties. The housing market is, and real estate market is very volatile right now. But it's we've got to push through with these types of options. If that's the case, it would also be the case with some of the other projects, just in terms of the the inflation environment we're experiencing right now. Construction costs are also notoriously volatile in the sense that things are kind of increasing right now. So wanted to point that out for this, but it's not unique to the acquisition. Pricing volatility was not unique to the acquisition alternative. Again, it's a permanent solution, the only real true permanent solution. They apply 100-year useful life to these things, but it essentially is permanent, given the deed restriction. And one of the definite desirable pieces of an acquisition program is that this is it's a very flexible option. We can do those things. We can acquire buildings in kind of clusters. Like I said, there's some flexibility to doing it kind of in a phased approach. And also it frees up some space to be able to look at additional land uses. So I'm going to do let's see. Okay, we're kind of going over on time here. Want to make sure wrap up and then leave some time for questions. So that kind of gets us to the path to mitigation. Here's kind of the summary of all those benefit cost numbers. So that really paints a picture. That's kind of why we're headed in the direction of we very much like what we're seeing with the potential buyout program. Has both the highest benefit potential and also it's the strongest benefit cost ratio, given the conceptual analysis that we've done for the costs and all the flood results, et cetera. So a couple more slides to get through, and then we'll kind of shift over to questions. So next steps kind of for Stantec and for just us working with Doug and the city. Basically finalizing the results. So I mentioned they're conceptual in some degree. We have kind of the last query for additional data to factor into. There's a lot of different inputs. We didn't get into that, but a lot of different inputs going into this, not surprisingly. So we're making sure we incorporate anything that we missed kind of for the final run of these things. Again, trying to get input from you all and understand the individual circumstances that might be playing into this. Look more closely at these potential clusters, like I mentioned. So it's likely that we'll do these things kind of in phases. So taking those next steps to kind of factor in input that we get from you all and see where that kind of leads us as far as putting together a final funding strategy, which, like we said, is the goal of all this. And one thing I will mention, we didn't cover this too much, but we are also looking at a scenario where we buy out particularly all of the buildings south of University Boulevard and kind of that kind of the worst area in terms of flooding, that is, and redeveloping that land potentially as park space, or we're looking at also like a stream restoration alternative to see if we can actually pull the water surface elevations and pull the flood depths down a little bit more to maybe allow for some of the people kind of on the fringe of the floodplain. Maybe they don't have to worry quite as much, that those tend not to show as favorably in terms of individual benefit cost metrics, but we can maybe even improve their situation further by looking at some additional land uses that could account for more floodplain storage and that sort of thing. So I think I'm handing this back to Doug, who you can close us out kind of with what to expect from the city and just kind of overall next steps for you all.
Yeah, thanks, Jared. So you can see we've still got a fair amount of work to do. Stantec's got some more dialing in of the information. But at this point, just as importantly, and probably more so, is that for us to really be able to take the next step with this planning process and get to a point of having a preferred recommendation, a defined strategy that the city council can consider, and then decide to allocate resources for its implementation, you and us, the city, need to have conversations, right? This is not something the city is imposing on any property. Again, as was indicated, these are voluntary efforts. Our goal is to work with each one of you, and I do truly mean that. Let's talk one-on-one to see what makes the most sense for your situation. You may assess your risk and say, yeah, I'm ready to go. I've seen the flooding too many times and I don't want to deal with it. Let's talk about how to make that happen. It may be, I understand my risk, but maybe I want to make some interim improvements because I need to keep this thing going for a few more years. Great. Let's talk about that and build a strategy for that. It could mean, again, you're on the fringe of the floodplain. You're willing to take some risk. You're willing to maybe make some relatively modest investments on an interim basis or dealing with some of that floodproofing. Great. Let's again talk about that and see how the city can meet you where you are with your needs. So really in the next 30 days or so, 45 days, I want to encourage each of you to kind of assess your risk. And then I would absolutely appreciate an opportunity to come and visit with you, or we can get on a Zoom or a phone call or whatever it is. And let's talk about this situation. And like I said, try to find what is going to make the most sense for you and for the city to have a more resilient future in this space. So we're not worrying about what's going to happen every time it rains. So that's the big takeaway message that I'd like to leave you with. Like I said, we have a lot of work to do just to kind of get to that point, technical analysis. We need to combine that with the specific property owner and property specific information to really make this thing work. But ultimately, we need to get through that to be in a point where we can make a recommendation to the city council. We'd like to be in that position come April of this year. If we have property owner interest and the city council continues to be committed to this area in terms of flood risk reduction because property owners desire city's continued action, then we would be looking to build that plan to start making the funding request from the federal government, from the state government, from anybody and everybody else that we can find that's willing to be a partner in this solution. Those efforts will all lead to those opportunities for the funding, but they are challenging. They take a lot of time, they take a lot of energy, they take a lot of patience and tenacity. And for those people that are motivated to work with the city along those lines, we at this point are kind of queued up to start doing that hard work later this year. And ideally, again, if we have projects to work on and property owners willing to work with us on those projects, we have successful funding, we would be talking about trying to make that first round or that first phase of efforts become reality in 2023. Many times, the funding sources that we're talking about using have about a 30 to 36 month requirement of actual doing. So although, we may know and have that award in 2023, it isn't necessarily that we have to make the action occur in 2023. Even if all of you wanted to do something, the city and the city staff and the city's horsepower to be able to do that, we are going to have to prioritize. We are going to have to kind of figure out a process to be able to help as many people as we can, as quickly as we can. But it's, again, going to be over time. Our goal, and again, this is simply to try and put something in the ground as a stake. We're trying to say in 10 years' time, we would like to not have to worry about flood risk on people and property. And if we can get this all accomplished, either buyouts or flood proofing or redevelopment or whatever it is, we'd like to kind of be done with flooding in the University Boulevard area in about 10 years time. That's kind of our goal. That's our target. But as I said, this is a meet you where you are kind of a project. And I am sincere about that. So please, we'll take some questions, but I know these things are very specific. Your circumstances are unique, and very much we'll be happy to sit down and talk about what your specific circumstances need to make this thing work. So with that, we'll take some questions. We also have a QR code there. It'll just link you quickly to a very, very short little survey. And it's principally just asking a few questions around your property. And then more importantly, an identification of if you have an interest in having a further discussion. It'll just queue up my staff to reach out to you to see if we can find that time in the coming weeks to sit down and have a face-to-face and really talk this thing through. So that's kind of the quick part of the presentation, not so quick, but we do want to have an opportunity. If you do have some questions, love to try and answer those tonight. Or like I said, give me a call, shoot me an email, and we'll find a time to sit and talk. And feel free if you want to throw the question in the chat, if you have it. Otherwise, you know, we got a small enough group here that if you want to unmute yourself and just throw the question out, we can deal with it that way as well.
Doug, I don't believe I have any general questions about the presentation. I thought it was very informative, covered a lot of topics thoroughly, and I think I might have some specific questions, comments about my specific situation, but for presentation, I'm good. Thank you.
Appreciate that, Sam, and absolutely reach out, fill in the survey, whatever. We'll find a time to sit down and talk about whatever we can do together to make your situation work.
Yeah, appreciate that. Thanks, Doug, and thanks to the Stantec individuals. Great job.
Any other folks, questions, comments, concerns? We're here for a while if you'd like to chat. Otherwise, like I said, I encourage you to leave your feedback on the survey, or, you know, again, call, email, whenever it's convenient.
Excellent. Thank you. Oh, nice.
Okay, folks, if there aren't any questions, that'll probably do it for us tonight. And then, like I said, please feel free to reach out. We'll come and meet and see if we can find a time to chat. Thanks so much for all of your time tonight.